Hey everybody, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. We are in Matthew chapter 25 at the beginning of the parable of the 10 virgins, the 10 bridesmaids, depending on your translation. And there's so much happening in just the first sentence. We're getting a bunch of payoffs here. This is one of those moments, it's a hot spot in the Bible where a whole lot pays off and a whole lot happens in one very small amount of words. And so we're trying to do the legwork to run all around the Old Testament and the New Testament to make sure that we are properly prepped for everything that is being brought up and referenced here, everything that is being paid off. Episodes or multiple episode runs like this are kind of like YouTube Easter egg videos where they're like, all right, you will not believe what just happened in this Star Wars show. But first we got to go learn like 10 things about how Star Wars is just been floating around for 10 or 20 years so we can appreciate better what just happened. And so we got a tiny bit more legwork to do. I think the payoff will be great. I'm going to have Jeff play some music and we're going to pick it up right where we left off after the last couple of episodes. One of the big important implications of this parable of the 10 virgins or bridesmaids at the beginning of Matthew chapter 25 is that we're finally getting some clarity as to when this wedding happens and what this wedding looks like. When does it go from this long, delayed betrothal, indeterminate time period that we've been looking at and talking about since all the way back in centuries before Jesus in the Old Testament through the prophets? When do we go from that to like, now this thing is real, it's happening, the celebration is on, the banquet is occurring? And once again, this parable tips the hand that it's getting way closer and it's going to happen. Remember, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away, which echoes what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5. Not the least bit of this law is going to go away. It's all going to be fulfilled in Jesus. So is the case with this wedding motif. We're going to round that out. It's another one of those loose ends that is going to be taken care of and tied up. So what's the expectation? What's the message then? Well, the engagement is still on. It's been really rocky and ugly. I mean, heck, even Mary and Joseph's engagement hit a couple of pretty tricky bumps in the road. But the wedding is still on. It just isn't neatly and tidily scheduled the way you and I think of a wedding today. Remember Matthew chapter 22, like when the wedding's ready, you just go let people know, oh, it's ready now, and that's when it's on. You don't know exactly the day or the hour that a wedding like that is going to occur in this culture. So it serves as a really great illustration for what Jesus is trying to communicate, but present in the idea of the engagement between God as husband who will come and straighten things out and redeem and make all of this stuff work, and humanity, or Israel as it was in the Old Testament. Implicit in that is this idea of delay. And delay is another theme that we have seen throughout particularly the parables of Jesus, throughout all the Gospels, and that we see Christians wrestling with later on in the New Testament, that we see the disciples wondering about. Like, what? I mean, really, the question at the beginning of chapter 24 is kind of rooted in that word delay. Like, how long are we talking about here? What do we need to know in order to be ready? It seems like a bunch of those parables that we've looked at, especially in the second half of Matthew, have some sort of thing where the master is away and he's sending representatives, he's doing business. Implicitly, there's some kind of delay, and all of this stuff, like, it's still going to be sorted out. Like, this is still happening. We just got a ways to go. Again, the parable we just got done looking at the end of chapter 24, the one about the master of the house who's got the goofus servant and the gallant servant. And the goofus servant blows everything off because the delay makes him think, yeah, he's never coming back. And the gallant servant is like, there's a delay, but that's all the more reason that I got to be ready every single day and doing things the right way because I don't know when the master is going to return. This issue of God's timeline versus human timeline, this issue of the human perception of a very long delay, this issue of the 400 years of prophetic silence between what we call the Old Testament and what we call the New Testament, all of that was front and center in the minds of the people Jesus is talking to. All of that is part of the national identity, the theological identity of these people. And come on, if you're a Christian right now, it's part of your identity. Now, how often have Christians over the centuries looked at planet Earth and been like, all right, I need to do my thing to try to help make this thing better at kingdom values, and that's my job, salt and light, just like it says in Matthew 5, but also, hey, come Lord Jesus, man, this is really tough and really difficult, and like, how long are we actually talking about here? And that's why the Bible has to even acknowledge that people think of timelines in a certain way, but God is not slow in keeping his promises. It's just kind of your perception of slowness that affects whether or not you're tracking with or resonate with the timeline. So then, the parable of the 10 virgins or bridesmaids is very theologically front-loaded. The setup kind of is the parable here. It tells us that we're talking about another kingdom value, an important detail about the kingdom that is different than normal kingdoms. We got that right up front with the language the kingdom of heaven is like. We know we're talking about a contrast between foolishness and wisdom, like in the style of the old Proverbs. There's a get it right, there's a get it wrong approach. We know we are talking about the Old Testament motif of God as the bridegroom and the expectation that comes with that. But finally, number 4, that means we are also implicitly talking about the all of history plus Old Testament notion of delay and the human perception of that delay on the part of God that can be really troubling and faith-rattling and can cause one to behave like the goofus servant who's like, the delay is just too long. I'm out. I'm no longer going to waste my time being eyes up or attentive, versus the gallant servant who's like, hey, that's one more day that's gone by. That's one day closer that we are. I'm going to stay eyes up on all of this stuff. Some of these parables that we've looked at, the setup is really, really simple. It's easy to understand, and then the big payoff is just in the little twist. And we do have a twist coming that we're going to look at here in the next couple of days. But here, the bigger workload for you and me as modern readers to understand what's going on here is in what we've just spent the last few days doing, and that is really wrapping our brains around the setup. And now that we got the setup in place, like, I think everything else is just going to neatly sort itself out. We should be able to track with what Jesus means pretty easy here. And then I guess the one more thing to put symmetry on this, going all the way back to the stuff I was talking about the other day in the little introduction thing about that video game. The eyes-uppedness, the attentiveness, the getting it rightedness in response to this delay, in response to God's promise in this engagement to come and resolve things. The right response is going to be the one who's like, I just knocked literally everything, like 4 Bibles and a computer off of my desk. That was catastrophic. I'm so sorry. That's my old Bible too. That's just one more war wound that thing's going to have. What were we doing? Oh yeah. I was going to say, like, the last point. I'm leaving all of that in there. You just get to hear my clumsiness and calamity. The last thing is, what does the person who's reading this parable and internalizing it do? Well, they look at the reality of the situation, and like the good Elden Ring player, they allocate their potions, they use their resources in a way that acknowledges that there might be some more delay as we perceive delay. And so the metaphorical, attentive bridesmaid is eyes up and understands that the bridegroom might come at any given time. You got to be ready. But that bridesmaid is also paced out and thinking long-term in terms of resources, because the return of the master, the bridegroom, might be a while. And Jesus' instructions would seem to compel the listener, the kingdom citizen, the metaphorical bridesmaid, the disciple, whomever is looking for that return. Jesus' instructions would seem to be saying, like, look, you got to be eyes up and ready at any given moment. But also, we're on God's timeline here. And so you also should be building for the long haul, because as you and I as people perceive of time, it also might be a while. I'm going to wrap it up there as I survey the damage to my super old Bible. I'm so sorry. I just took a giant chunk out of Matthew 24 and Matthew 6. I don't know if that's ever going to be the same again. Whatever, a little spit and duct tape. We'll get that up and running. It'll be ready to go for next time around. Thank you for processing through the parts of the Bible where we got to jump around a little bit to understand all of the imagery and language that's being brought to bear. If we don't do that, I think we're just going to picture things that make sense in our world and in our moment, and we're going to miss a lot of the depth of these metaphors and these images that are being used, and we're not going to understand what the actual instruction or the actual idea that Jesus is trying to communicate is. So hopefully that's helpful. I have fun going on these little deep dive run around the Bible binges with you. Thanks for indulging me on that. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.